Imagine you have two heavyweight boxers that are about to fight, and one of them, the US in this case, is the bigger fighter. It's bigger and it's probably still stronger, but it picked this fight on a whim. It hasn't set its feet, it's not in a stance, and it just started swinging haymakers. The Chinese have been preparing for this fight for a decade.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Dmitry Grozoubinski on the show. He's a negotiations and trade expert. He's the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and he's the author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade. So we've spoken to him about this rare earth minerals deal between the US and Ukraine officially being signed. Who benefits from that? Did Ukraine get enough out of it? We also speaking to him about this economic report from the US. There's been a 0.3% economic slump and how Donald Trump has responded to this. So, of course, we see him blame Joe Biden and his administration for this pretty negative outlook about the situation in the United States and how tariffs contributed to it. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Dmitry Grozoubinski, negotiations and trade expert. He's the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Such a pleasure.
It's such a big week for trade and negotiations, and it was perfect to have you on today because we have to begin with the news that the US and Ukraine have officially signed this profit-sharing minerals deal, which gives the US and Ukraine a 50-50 access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals and in turn fund investment in Ukraine's reconstruction and local investment. Now, this seems to be more of an equal partnership deal than we had originally thought they would broker. So it's a bit of a win for Ukraine, especially as the US seems to have left off any kind of debt paying back, because originally we thought they were going to have to pay back $300 billion of aid to the United States, despite the fact that they'd only given them $130 billion. So, Dmitry, can you walk me through this deal? Do you think it's a fair trade agreement?
So it's important to understand the timeline here. Under the Biden administration, the Ukraine and US had already begun negotiating a memorandum of understanding on cooperation around future mining in Ukraine. The historical context for all this, or the geostrategic context, is that the US and China are in competition about who can secure mineral extraction rights around the world for what are called critical raw materials, the things that technologies of the future need. China has a huge head start and the US is panicking a bit, and Ukraine has a significant percentage of the rare earth minerals that are out there. Ukraine has some of them buried in the soil. And so the US has wanted to make sure that it has access to them for some time. When the Trump administration came in, Trump sort of repackaged this, at least in his rhetoric, as saying this is going to be a quid pro quo deal where the Ukrainians are going to pay the US back for aid the US has and hasn't given to Ukraine by basically handing over the profits of these minerals into the future forever. That was completely unacceptable to Ukraine. If nothing else, that's not how aid works. And so it became contentious. But this deal reflects something much, much closer to what the Biden administration had been contemplating, which is a joint investment fund where Ukraine and the US make contributions into it. And that goes into trying to turn some of these minerals in the ground into actual mines, with that control being jointly held by the US and Ukraine as shareholders, equal shareholders in this fund. The profits will be reinvested back into Ukraine, but the vision is US companies will go in there, which will create benefits for the US and will prevent Chinese companies from moving in, while also giving the US an incentive to invest in and theoretically protect its investments in Ukraine.
Dmitry, how important are these rare earth minerals for the United States and eventually help its economy? Because we know that the US probably won't see the profits from these earth minerals for a while, but eventually down the track, how much will they help the US economy?
This is a really complicated question. The rare earth supply chain is really hard to get your head around. Uh, they become more and more significant the longer a trade war with China goes on, because
Mm,
China controls so much of the access, and you need this stuff to build everything from solar panels to semiconductors. So, and especially for things like battery technology. So it's very important. However, the supply chain isn't just the rocks and the ores, it's also refining, and that's where China truly has a disproportionate edge. And so just having access to Ukrainian mines doesn't really solve the problem for the US of where to get refined earth materials. And then finally, a lot of these things are years away from actually being developed, even if the war were to stop tomorrow. But the war doesn't look likely to stop tomorrow, and you can imagine investors being pretty hesitant to go and make multi-billion-dollar long-term investments in a place that could devolve back into war again. And so this in no way solves US problems around critical minerals, but it's a positive step.
yeah. One of the things that Ukraine had been asking from the United States, Dmitry, was basically signing on to provide Ukraine with security and protection in the event that they needed it down the track if a peace deal was brokered. And of course, Russia ended up, not going ahead and basically invading the country again. So, despite the fact that this agreement, this rare earth minerals agreement, did not provide this protection that they want, uh, people believe that perhaps the US having this skin in the game now by having this investment in Ukraine's minerals, is it enough of a financial gain for the US that they would take Ukraine's defense more seriously down the track?
I think we have to be realistic here. When we talk about US security guarantees, direct ones, what I think sometimes people envision is US troops on the ground defending Ukrainian territory in the event of Russian aggression in breach of a treaty. Now, that brings two nuclear powers into conflict, and it means US lives on the line. The threshold to get there is unbelievably high, not just for the Trump administration, for any US administration. So, the catch 22 in this war from the beginning is that while the US might like Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, Ukraine can't trust the word of Vladimir Putin unless there are guarantees in place to make sure he keeps it. And
Mm.
the US and even Europe have been pretty darn reluctant to give those because it could bring them into direct conflict with Russia and nuclear power. So, when we talk about what this deal does, I think at most it incentivizes the US to provide more military aid, so materiel and money, to harden Ukraine, to make
Mm.
it less attractive as an invasion target for Russia because it's more armed and better able to resist that invasion. But in terms of the kind of security guarantees that would be needed to secure any kind of lasting peace, this falls well short of that. And frankly, the US isn't going to war with Russia over a few mining companies in the Donbass.
Of course. Just finally on this section of the interview, Dmitry, when you're looking at this trade deal, this rare earth minerals deal, are you looking at it thinking it was a 50-50 equal partnership between the two nations, or are you looking at it that one side of the party got more out of it?
I mean, first of all, I wouldn't really call it a trade deal
Yeah.
to begin with. Nothing about the terms of trade is changing. This is a kind of joint investment framework. I think it is about as equal as it can be, given the sort of balance of powers at play. We are talking about the world's only superpower negotiating with a country that is in a fight for its life and which has only spent about 10 years reforming itself into a modern economy in any serious way. This is not an equal discussion to begin with, given the dependency Ukraine has on various forms of US support. But given all of that, the actual final result, I know that Ukrainian media is trumpeting it as a win for Volodymyr Zelensky. And it's always telling what people say about themselves at home.
Absolutely. Dmitry, let's get into these latest findings on the US economy that were released on Wednesday. On Wednesday, the economy shrunk by 0.3% during the first quarter of the year. This marks the worst quarter the US has seen since 2022. Trump has, of course, blamed Biden's stock market from his last quarter. So when you're looking at this 0.3%, what can you attribute this drop to?
So, with all of the usual caveats about my not being an economist, what smarter people than me are saying is what we're seeing is a combination of things led to this big drop. First, there was a huge surge of imports. If you tell manufacturers, if you tell retailers that, hey, I'm about to start playing with tariffs at the border in a really serious way, one of the things that they do is they immediately put in really big orders to try to get in ahead of those tariffs coming in. And so what we saw in the quarter this report covers is a massive surge of imports. And just the way the GDP formula works is that you subtract imports. So higher levels of imports make GDP go down. Secondly, you saw a real hit to consumer confidence and consumer spending. When you cause a lot of chaos in the economy, when the economic news is relentlessly bad, when people see the stock market is all over the place, when the currency is doing strange things, when bonds are shaky, people put off making the big investment, buying the second home, buying a car, going on holiday. Generally speaking, people get defensive in their spending, and given that GDP basically just measures economic activity in the country, one sure way to make economic activity go down is to stop being economically active and just sit on your money for a while to see what happens. And I think Americans were doing that in the quarter this report covers.
That difference between importing and exporting, Dmitry, there was such a large disparity, and I did want to get your thoughts on if it was that panic importing after the announcement of these tariffs. So when you see Donald Trump blaming Biden for this and saying that the Trump administration, they need time to turn the economy around, that it was just a bad result because they inherited a poor economy, it was a Biden overhang, and that this situation cannot be fixed within 3 months. Are you looking at that thinking, no, that's incorrect, it is the result of tariffs, it is a result of these announcements and the fact that American consumers obviously panic?
Donald Trump blaming President Biden for things is not exactly out of character for him and his approach to political communication. Again, the economists I talk to at, say, like Aurora Macro Strategies that I work with are all pretty universal in saying that the Biden economy, on the metrics that we use to measure economic success, was phenomenal. Trump inherited a really, really strong economy. Yes, it had some problems with inequality. Yes, it had some problems with inflation overhang and prices for things like housing. But overall, the economy was really, really strong. And really, all President Trump had to do to cruise for 4 years, in the same way that he did in his first term when he inherited a strong and recovering Obama economy, was basically just leave it alone.
Yeah.
If you compare the economic data from this quarter to the same quarter last year, you can immediately see the difference. Donald Trump has introduced a huge amount of economic uncertainty into the US economy, and that is having consequences the way basic economics said it would. There's really not a lot to debate here.
Yeah, and when you're speaking to these economists, Dmitry, and you see this this reaction from the US market, but not only that, the global reaction when it came to these tariffs. Is there a concern that a global recession is looming?
So it's interesting. They are certainly very concerned about the US economy and they appreciate that that will have run on effects. But they're, for example, significantly more optimistic about the EU economy.
Mm.
They're seeing positive signs in the EU for the first time. They joke that the Trump administration has managed to scare markets in the US so much that American investors have discovered that the European Union, that Europe also has equities and shares they could invest in, which they never previously would have thought of. There is a growing sense of that EU is less exposed to this than it could be, and given some of the decisions being made in places like Germany to begin really investing in infrastructure, there is some light on the tunnel there. Um, the Chinese economy had been slowing for a while, and obviously being locked out of the US market will present significant challenges, but it's still surging ahead in some areas, and so it could be an engine for growth. And a lot depends on how things play out in the next sort of 6 months to a year. This is obviously not good for the global economy, but the people that I talk to have not yet put on, ash and sackcloth and gone into mourning about the state of the world, whereas they are significantly more maudlin, frankly, about what's going on in North America and the US.
Dmitry, as someone that covers trade and you're an expert in trade negotiations and you teach so many people about what even trade is, when you're looking at Donald Trump's announcement when he invoked these tariffs on so many countries, and now he basically says, in response to this economic report, he basically says that a boom will happen, a boom is on the horizon as a reaction to the tariffs, because he's still standing by that they're a really good thing for the economy. So when you hear this word boom from Donald Trump, are you believing that that will occur? And if so, is it is it so far in the future, or is it something that will be there soon as he says?
Well, first of all, it's very difficult to conceptualize what he is imagining happening when he describes this boom. Most Americans work in services. Somewhere between 7 and 8% of the US workforce works in manufacturing. If you take his theory of the case as he presents it, if everything works out exactly the way that he hopes, so these tariffs cause a flood of supply chain components of factories to move from abroad into the US, and even he's able to negotiate more market access abroad, so the US becomes a more competitive exporter. The way that modern factories work is you don't employ 100,000 people anymore. You employ a much smaller number of specialists to basically manage a robotic supply line. So in the best case scenario, what we are talking about is maybe 1% more of the US workforce moving into manufacturing from what it's currently doing. You can't create a boom in the US by shifting 1% of workers who already have jobs, by the way. The US economy is at something like 4% unemployment. So by moving people from maybe some service job into a manufacturing job, that is not magically going to create an economic boom in the United States. That's just not how math works. And then I add on top of the fact that what he's doing doesn't look like it will work. And we can get into why that is if you want.
Well, I want to get into what industry you think will probably hurt the most. You mentioned manufacturing and it being 7% of 7 or 8% of workers in the United States. Do you think that that's the industry that will be hit the hardest by these tariffs?
So it will depend. Some of them. So the challenge for U.S. manufacturing is that it relies on a lot of components and parts and machinery from overseas. So when you institute tariffs, you give the things that those factories produce an advantage domestically, because foreign goods are paying tariffs to come in and their goods aren't. But you often cut them off or massively raise their costs given for the parts that they need and the machinery and the materials that they need. So some factories are going to get hit quite hard. Those that rely on components they can't readily get in the US are going to find themselves significantly less cost competitive. Some others may benefit because if all of your suppliers are US and all of their suppliers are US, or you can get what you need from places other than China perhaps, then you've suddenly got an advantage. But setting that kind of aside, overall, I think what's going to hurt is the entire economy because this is going to drive down investment. It's going to drive up costs, which means it's going to drive up inflation, which makes people spend less in shops and spend less on services and haircuts. And it's also having an effect on US bond rates, which makes it more expensive for the US government to borrow money, more expensive for the US government to pay back its debts or pay interests on its debts, which means the US government has less money to spend on things that boost growth and boost economic prosperity.
I want to get into the situation between the US and China now, Dmitry, and you and I can speak about all that stuff in a later date because there's so much involved in why this will hurt the US economy and why American consumers will feel the brunt of this despite what the Trump administration has been saying. But for the average person reading the news when it comes to this back and forth trade war between the United States and China, it actually does feel like a roller coaster and has so since February. It's really hard to keep up with where we're at, this back and forth reciprocal tariff. So can you walk me through the situation right now and if there is a country between the US and China who has the upper hand in this trade war?
Yeah, absolutely. So the current situation as it stands is bilateral escalation. So the US began by escalating its tariffs from where they were into sort of around the 50% range. That led to Chinese retaliation, which matched those higher tariffs with the US. That led to US retaliation, which led to Chinese retaliation. And now they're basically sitting with tariffs on one another well over 100%. For your viewers at home, any tariff over about 30% may as well just be a ban on most trade. A tariff over 130%, nobody's paying that. Nobody is buying anything if they have to pay, 150% of its value on top of its value in taxes. So effectively, you've kind of ended trade. We haven't seen the effects of that because there is a time delay of how long ships take to get from China to the US and vice versa. So it takes about 15 to 20 days to get to the west coast of the US from China and about 30 to 40 days to get to the east coast where some of the bigger ports are. And so we're about to see the impacts of that as sort of because of that time delay. But there are definitely going to be sort of shortages on shelves, supply chain disruptions, and all sorts of things.
Oh, wow. It's going to be like COVID days with the supply chain disruptions. But Dmitry, I want your response to this comment from Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins. She told CNN that the bottom line with China is this: they need us more than we need them. Is that correct?
No, it's simply not. The way to conceptualize this, if you want like a sports metaphor, which
Yes.
with two Australians talking, we have to reach for, is imagine you have two heavyweight boxers that are about to fight. And one of them, the US in this case, is the bigger fighter. It's bigger and it's probably still stronger. But it picked this fight on a whim. It hasn't set its feet, it's not in a stance, and it just started swinging haymakers. The Chinese have been preparing for this fight for a decade. And the US has not at all been strategic in how it deploys its economic strength. There were ways that the US could have approached this trade war with China at a moment of its choosing. It could have done all sorts of strategic things like targeting carefully which products it hits, stockpiling the things it knows China would cut off exports of that it needs, putting in place preemptively legislation and funds to support industries that would get hit when they're locked out of China, like US farmers, soybeans, etc. They could have done all that, but they didn't. The US administration basically didn't even know they were going to do this until they did it.
It does
And
feel like it's on a
so
whim.
it's absolutely on a whim. There's some reporting from inside Trump's inner circle that as late as 2 hours before that grand ceremonial announcement with the game show like list of every country's tariffs, the Commerce and Treasury Secretary still didn't know what the final formula would be to apply these tariffs.
And there's
Now,
so
if they...
Sorry, you continue.
No, I was going to say, well, if they don't know, that means the rest of the US system doesn't know and can't get ready. And the important thing that I think your viewers need to understand about global trade and the US government is that it can solve problems, but you have to let it. And if you take it by surprise and you start throwing grenades into these incredibly complicated global supply chains without warning, without preparation, and without a strategy, then your economic might doesn't matter as much. And can I say one more thing? Sorry, I realize I'm rambling. You asked me about who has the upper hand in a trade war. In a trade war, the way that I look at it, there are three things that kind of matter. It's your economic strength. The US has the advantage there. It's still the bigger, more powerful economy, I would say. How strategically you deploy it. The US has completely bungled that. And then thirdly, kind of the home front. To what extent do your people believe in what you're doing? To what extent are they willing to suffer pain in order to endure long enough for you to win? And to what extent do you have a positive story to tell? Now, what the US has done is handed China a phenomenally positive story to tell its people. It can rally its people around the flag, saying like, listen, the US just pounced on us out of nowhere, unprovoked, and we have to stand shoulder to shoulder as the Chinese people to push back on this. Every poll in the US suggests that the US don't fully understand why the Trump administration is doing this and don't like it. And so they've bungled that too, and that gives China a real upper hand, I think.
Just a final question, Dmitry. Trump had reportedly called Amazon founder Jeff Bezos this week after it was reported that Amazon had planned to detail how much trade tariffs would cost consumers when they were checking out with their baskets. We know that other companies have done that. I think Shine's done that as well. Other retail companies have done that just to let their consumers know why there's an extra tax on what they're buying. But Amazon then came out saying that they actually never had any intention of doing this. But when we watched the White House leap into attack mode at that press conference, does it just go to the show that the Trump administration feel the pressure from companies as they try to spin this narrative that American consumers won't be affected by these tariffs, that it won't increase their cost of living?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The Trump administration has been caught from the beginning in a trap of, I suppose, Trump's rhetoric. Trump has from the beginning been describing, as he's wont to do, tariffs as being something that is paid by foreigners and foreign companies. And I guess somewhat ironically, that makes it harder for him to be honest now and sort of sell his vision by saying, yeah, okay, maybe your prices will go up, but it'll be worth it in service to this grand dream I have of restoring US manufacturing. So the Trump administration is caught in this trap where anytime you get overt proof that, hey, listen, you as a consumer are paying these tariffs, you can see them right here in your bill, they kind of have to push back on that because it is such a clear, overt demonstration for a regular person of policy coming home to roost. This is something Trump has always instinctively understood. When the stimulus checks were going out during COVID, or tax cuts from Trump, he would personally sign them a check. Every American taxpayer would receive this check from Donald Trump. He understands that for a lot of Americans, policy doesn't feel real until you're holding it in your hands. And so things like Amazon Hall, I believe it was, potentially listing tariff impacts, his sixth sense for the public says we have to push back on that. We have to basically signal in a slightly mafioso way to American companies that if they do things like that, they will earn the ire of Donald Trump and his supporters in an effort to basically dissuade them from doing it, because they know it runs contrary to their narrative and they know it'll bring the reality of what they're doing home to people.
Especially when he campaigned so heavily on making lower income households richer. That's what he was planning to do. So I guess it would contradict his entire campaign promise.